think I'm fully mic'd. Am I fully mic'd? Okay. I'm fully instrumented. Actually, I'm fully instrumented like the Arctic is going to be instrumented. I'm going to make that point. So I wanted to discuss a little bit today on ideas related to this notion of the new Arctic that NSF is also very interested in. NSF last couple of years ago put out a series of research big ideas, and one of them is actually about navigating the new Arctic, and I'll say why there is interest in that, and try to link that to the data challenges that arise. So the outline of my presentation will be, we'll talk about what is this new Arctic and the challenges and what would be the research agenda. I'll give you some examples of operational data platforms that SDSC is actually operating right now, which are highly relevant for this work. And then I'll try to indicate some ideas for a data architecture that would be useful for this kind of project, but actually in general useful for, I think, most science projects. And my last slide, which I want to make sure I get to, is to talk about the next steps that we are planning. So the Arctic zone, as this diagram shows on the left-hand side, is you're seeing the pole from above. And the reason this region is interesting is a lot of countries that are kind of increasingly getting closer to each other because, as the figure on the right shows, the melting ice sheets and the melting ice surface is actually making this much more navigable, and there's a lot of interest, both social, economic, and political in that area. So this is what brings the interest for looking at the new Arctic. So the research agenda that is under this big idea that NSF has talked about is to deploy observational systems of all sorts, including terrestrial, marine, glacial, atmospheric, as well as social. And that's a big part of it because there are a lot of people who live in the Arctic and they're being affected by these changes. This requires tight integration of sensors and computing because a lot of this stuff has a lot of what will happen, and the predictions are simulated, and we want to combine that with observed data. There's real-time adaptation of control autonomy because, again, and AI and big data, as Mike mentioned, big data all in caps is what we are interested in. And there's a lot of that being collected, and the changes are happening very dynamically, so we need to worry about that. We're also interested as part of the research agenda on what are the human responses to these changes happening, because these are happening at a generational level, within a generation, so we don't have to wait for a long time for all of this. What are the feedbacks between all of those changes in the civil infrastructure and the social infrastructure? And finally, how do we educate the populations that are actually even just living there so that they themselves realize what's going on, and they're also, first of all, they also realize all the science agenda that's right around them and eventually can participate in this science. So some of the pressing challenges is there's an urgency to get things done because of the pace and scale at which things are changing. There's need for key advances in predictions and observations. A huge challenge that we would be very interested in, SDSC has special skills in doing this, is how do we federate all these extremely heterogeneous data systems? How do we federate models and analytics? How do we improve the predicting capabilities? And you just heard about all the various ways in which we can use machine learning and deep learning, and that'll all become extremely important. And then dealing, of course, with the harsh environment. So let me flip to a couple of platforms that are already ready to undertake some of this work at SDSC. One is called OpenTopography.org, which has been funded for several years by the NSF, that serves LiDAR elevation data to the national and basically international community. And another called OpenAltimetry.org, which leverages the open topography technologies, but funded by NASA to serve the ICESat data, which is, of course, extremely relevant because it's going to be taking images that are relevant for the new Arctic region that we will be looking at. So basically the way LiDAR processing, or if you want to think about any observational data processing happens, is you have these platforms that collect the data. In this case, there are some proprietary platforms and there are vendors who do this. The initial data gets processed by some group, and then that data gets served, in this case as three-dimensional point clouds, on a platform. And most of what scientists want is an easy access to this last part, the point cloud data, because they would like to have access to process data with the appropriate metadata, et cetera, that talks about how the processing was done. So the platforms that serve these data to the larger community are extremely essential in order to scale up the science. So that's basically what Open Topography does. It serves all those data sets. And if you go to opentopography.org, you'll see it all. This map shows the dots actually represent surveys, and the surveys are actually not dots, of course. They're planes flying over the surface, or in some cases satellites. So they're actually strips of land that are surveyed by LiDAR. And the data, a lot of the data in Open Topography comes from another NSF project called NCOM, National Center for Airborne LiDAR Mapping. But we also have data from other sources, such as states. That state of Indiana and state of Oregon have done a complete LiDAR survey of the entire state. So all of their data is in the repository. Private companies do these kind of surveys. And we also now support individual scientists, if they want to put up their data, whichever way they may have acquired it. There's a community contributed data set space in Open Topography. So all of that data that's in Open Topo actually now gets tagged with these schema.org tags. Okay, so that's essentially metadata that allows you to sort of capture some of the meaning of what the data set is all about, and allows search engines to index this. So in fact, there is a new search facility that Google has provided called Dataset Search. So if you go to the Google Dataset Search, Google actually comes to Open Topography and indexes all these schema.org tags, and you can actually find in Google Dataset Search all the Open Topo data. And that part of the work is actually undertaken as part of another NSF initiative called EarthCube, which has a group of repositories all got together, and they are called the Council of Data Facilities. So this shows in a little better way the output of the Google Dataset Search. If you type in Open Topography, you see on the left a list of all the data sets that Google found inside Open Topo, and then you see all the metadata provided in the box, in the main box. Now flipping to Open Altimetry, that's also a website you can go to. Currently holds ISAT data, and what you're seeing is the map that shows all the tracks of the data that are available. So each of those dots is actually a shot from the satellite. So it's a LiDAR shot of data, and so as the satellite is progressing, it's making all of those shots. And we are getting ready for the next NASA mission. NASA booth is right next door, so our neighbors are here, and we are actually helping. So as NASA launches the satellites and collects the data, we are the ones who are helping distribute that data to the larger community. And what we are getting ready for is the next NASA mission, which is ISAT-2, that's going to generate a lot more data. So it has a lot more tracks and greater shot density. So that's just zooming in, and you can see the details. Actually, you can see all the waveforms right on the website. I didn't do all of that, but you're welcome to go try out this. And if you click on any of these dots, you can actually see the waveform at that place, and the error information and all the metadata and so on. Okay. So now let's talk about, so we have some sense of the kinds of data we are collecting, the kinds of platforms. So we have to be clear in our heads that there's the data collection side, and then there's the data dissemination side. So when we are architecting these systems, we should be thinking about how is the data going to be disseminated to the much larger and very heterogeneous science community. As you saw before in the new Arctic, there is not just geoscientists, there are atmospheric scientists, there are social scientists, there are a whole range of people who want to get access to this. So we need to provide extremely easy ways of getting to the data, because any single scientist who's coming to the data may not be an expert in all the data that's out there, right? So the question here is, what kind of data ecosystem should we be planning? So as I said, at the bottom are all these platforms. In the case of New Arctic, we have satellite platforms like ISAT-2. We have all sorts of observing system platforms that NSF and other agencies are interested in deploying. We have ship-based platforms. That's NSF's latest ship, SIO's latest ship called Sally Ride. That's going to be collecting a lot of information through ship cruises. And there is simulation data from supercomputers. So all of these data need to be made available. I'm putting here some of the Nsf solicitations that have come out. So there is now a solicitation talking about ideas for the navigating the new Arctic. All of these data you want to be able to share through an open storage substrate. So open storage network is something that NSF has recently funded to support nationwide sharing of data. So the kind of data repositories, including open topography and open altimetry that I mentioned, and a host of others. I was just talking to folks from SC18 here and IRIS and so on. Those data could also be shared through the open storage network. What is important to remember is that the open storage network is not an archival system, it's actually work in process. So there is a need for creating a substrate of storage that allows scientists to easily ship data around and share it, move it from a supercomputer to a cloud in order to do maybe machine learning, et cetera, et cetera. So this is quite different from archival data, and it's very important in understanding a data ecosystem to understand what each of these pieces in the ecosystem are actually doing. Okay, so that's the open storage network. How do you keep provenance of information, whether it's work in process or archival data? There's a new initiative that NSF has just funded called the Open Science Chain at SDSC. One of the, actually the PI, Subha, is here. And the idea of the Open Science Chain is to use blockchain technologies to maintain provenance of information. And there's, you can do a Google search on the web and you'll find out more information about this project. And eventually, as I was showing you in the previous slides, you want to be able to get the semantic information out. You want to have the schema.org tags and other kinds of metadata so that you can do much more intelligent searches. So there's this notion of an open knowledge network, and the federal government has been running some workshops on trying to create this notion of an open knowledge network. So to me, this is sort of the ecosystem. You have storage substrate, you have things like open science chain to ensure that the data is all properly sort of accounted for and has provenance, and then you have the open knowledge network that allows you to do smart things like search and find the kind of data that you want to access. So once again, the major goals of NSF's New Arctic, navigating the new Arctic big idea, is to improve understanding of Arctic changes, create new enhanced research communities that are highly interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary in nature, and then have the research outcomes inform US policy and security and so on. So my last slide is to talk about the next steps. So one of the things we are planning to do here is propose a one-day session at the upcoming ACM KDD conference, which, as it happens, is in Anchorage, Alaska, which is about 500 miles from the Arctic. So that's going to be in August of next year. We would also like to propose a session at SACNAS, which is the National Diversity in STEM Conference, which will be in October in Honolulu, Hawaii, which is a place where you can actually reach some of these populations that live in places like Alaska and around the Arctic Circle. So if anyone is interested, feel free to contact me.